You have seen the stagecoach in 100 films. It thunders across the screen in a cloud of dust, horses at full gallop, the driver cracking his whip on the box, passengers inside jolting and clutching the leather straps with white-knuckled hands, while the wheels spin over the rutted track, and the landscape blurs past the windows. It looks fast, it looks dramatic, and in the way of all cinematic things, it looks like it lasts about 90 seconds before arriving somewhere interesting. The reality of stagecoach travel, in England from roughly 1650 through to the mid-19th century, in America from the 1780s through the 1880s, was so comprehensively different from this image that the word brutal is not an exaggeration. It is, if anything, an understatement. And today we are going to sit you inside a real stagecoach, on a real journey, in real historical conditions, and we are going to see exactly how long you last. Start with the coach itself, because the vehicle is the first thing that the romantic image gets wrong. A stagecoach was not a smooth, well-sprung, comfortable conveyance. It was a wooden box on wheels, and the suspension system, such as it was, consisted of leather thoroughbraces, thick straps of leather slung beneath the body of the coach, on which the passenger compartment rested. These absorbed some of the shock of the road. Some, not most, not enough. The motion of a stagecoach on a typical road of the 17th or 18th century was a continuous, violent, unpredictable series of lurches, jolts, drops, and sideways jerks that had no rhythm and no pattern, and offered no possibility of bracing for the next one, because the next one was always different from the last. The roads themselves deserve a moment of dedicated horror. The English roads of the pre-turnpike era, and the turnpike system, which introduced toll roads maintained to a minimum standard, did not become widespread until the mid-18th century, were not roads in any sense that the word implies today. They were tracks, maintained by local parishes under a legal obligation that is widely and cheerfully ignored, deeply rutted by the wheels of heavy wagons, churned into mud by rain and hooves, frozen into iron-hard ridges in winter, and dust-choked in summer. The ruts left by heavy freight wagons could be deep enough to overturn a coach if the driver misjudged the line, and overturning was not a rare event. It was a routine hazard of the journey, accepted with the same resigned practicality that modern travelers accept flight delays, except that flight delays do not typically break your collarbone. In England, the journey from London to Edinburgh before the improvement of the roads took somewhere between 10 and 12 days in reasonable conditions, longer in winter, when the roads were at their worst, and the short days cut the traveling hours. In America, the famous Butterfield Overland Mail Route, established in 1858 to carry mail and passengers from Missouri to California, covered roughly 4,000 kilometers in 25 days, meaning that passengers who paid for the privilege of riding the full route spent 25 days, day and night, without stopping, inside a moving stagecoach. 25 days, nearly 600 hours, with no suspension system worth the name, on roads that in many stretches were not roads at all, but simply the landscape, crossed by horses who were changed every 15 to 20 kilometers at relay stations, but whose passengers were not. Let's talk about what the inside of the coach actually looked like, because this is where the experience of stagecoach travel becomes intimate and inescapable. The interior of a standard English stage was designed to carry 4 passengers on 2 facing bench seats. The American Concord coach, which became the standard vehicle on Western routes, held 9 passengers inside, 3 rows of 3, sitting knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, with the middle row lacking any backrest and required to hold themselves upright by gripping leather straps suspended from the roof frame. For 25 days, knee to knee with strangers, in the dark, because the coach traveled at night as well as during the day on the express routes, and the small oil lamps fitted to the interior provided approximately enough light to confirm that there were people sitting next to you. The passengers themselves were, of course, unwashed. Everyone was unwashed by modern standards, and the inside of a stagecoach after several days of continuous travel was a sealed environment of considerable biological richness. The windows, where they existed at all, because many coaches had nothing but leather curtains in place of glass, were kept closed against the dust and the cold, which meant that the air inside the coach circulated exclusively among the people already inside it, absorbing their exhalations, their perspiration, the smell of their clothes and their bodies, and whatever they had most recently eaten, and then delivering it back to them in a continuous loop. Travelers of the period who wrote accounts of long stagecoach journeys return, again and again, to the smell, a specific, enclosed human smell that modern readers can reconstruct in their imaginations with only moderate difficulty. Sickness was endemic. The combination of violent motion, inadequate food, disrupted sleep, and the stress of sustained physical discomfort produced motion sickness in a significant proportion of passengers. And in the sealed interior of a moving coach, with no way to stop and no fresh air and nowhere to go, the practical consequences of one passenger's motion sickness rapidly became everyone's problem. Travelers writing about their journeys record this with a directness that makes clear it was not an occasional embarrassment, but a regular feature of the experience, managed with whatever cloths and containers the sufferers had the foresight to bring. Sleeping was theoretically possible, and practically a form of punishment. The passenger who fell asleep in a moving stagecoach was immediately subject to the full violence of the road, without the protective consciousness that allowed an awake person to brace, grip, and partially absorb the worst jolts. The sleeping passenger's head snapped against the side of the coach, against the shoulder of the person next to them, against the framework of the roof, in a sequence of involuntary collisions that alternately woke them and failed to wake them, producing the particular torture of exhaustion combined with the impossibility of rest. Some passengers attempted to sleep propped against each other in mutual, grudging support. The accounts of this arrangement, from both English and American travelers, suggest that it functioned marginally better than the alternative, which was to sit rigidly upright for 25 days, attempting not to touch anyone. Now let's talk about the cold, because the cold is the element that the cinematic version most consistently omits. A stagecoach in winter was not heated. It was not insulated. It was a wooden box with gaps in the joints through which the wind blew freely. The body heat of 4 to 9 passengers was the only warmth available. On an English winter night, on the road between Manchester and London, with the temperature below freezing, and the coach traveling at 12 to 15 kilometers per hour into a headwind, the inside of the coach was genuinely dangerous. Frostbite was a real risk on long winter runs, particularly for passengers who had not brought adequate clothing, and adequate clothing for a winter stagecoach journey meant layers that modern people would consider excessive, even for outdoor mountain activities. Travelers were advised to bring blankets, to wear multiple pairs of stockings, to wrap themselves in greatcoats of extraordinary thickness, and even so the records are full of people who arrived at their destinations unable to feel their feet. The outside passengers, those who traveled on the roof of the coach, exposed to the full force of the weather, for the reduced fare that reflected the reduced conditions, occupied a category of suffering that deserves separate recognition. In England, riding outside on top of the coach was the option available to those who could not afford inside passage, and in winter, it could be lethal. Drivers' records and newspaper accounts from the late 18th and early 19th centuries document passengers who froze to death on the roof of moving coaches, who simply stopped moving, stopped responding, and were found dead when the coach reached its next stop, their hands still gripping the rail from which rigor mortis had not yet released them. This happened, not once, not as a freak event, but with sufficient regularity that outside passengers in winter were considered to be accepting a genuine gamble on their survival. The stops, the coaching inns where horses were changed and passengers had the opportunity to descend, move, eat, and briefly remember what it felt like to exist in 3 dimensions, were the moments that the journey revolved around. And they were, in their own way, another ordeal. The time allowed at a coaching inn was strictly limited by the schedule, typically between 10 and 20 minutes, which was sufficient to change horses, allow the driver and guard to eat, and give passengers time to discover that the food available was cold, expensive, and either already gone, or of a quality that made its absence preferable. The inns on heavily traveled routes were perpetually overwhelmed, the kitchens producing whatever could be served fastest rather than whatever was best, and the famous English coaching inn of the 18th century imagination, warm, hospitable, with a roaring fire and a generous landlady, existed primarily in the writings of people who had not recently tried to eat at one during the 10-minute window between coach arrivals. Highwaymen. We should talk about highwaymen, because they are another element that the romantic version of stagecoach travel has thoroughly distorted. In film and fiction, the highwayman is a dashing figure, well-dressed, gallant, possibly in love with someone noble, pointing a pistol at the coach with a certain theatrical flair before accepting the passenger's valuables with a bow. The reality was considerably simpler and considerably less charming. Highway robbery was a crime committed by desperate men using violence or the credible threat of it to take money and goods from people who had no realistic means of resistance. The pistol was real. The threat was real. And while the majority of robberies ended without physical injury, because the highwaymen wanted the money, not a hanging for murder, the minority that did not end peacefully produced outcomes of considerable brutality. The risk of robbery varied enormously by route, time of period, and the state of law enforcement in the region. English highways of the late 17th and early 18th centuries were genuinely dangerous by any reasonable standard, and the introduction of the mounted patrol, effectively a highway police force, in the mid-18th century, was a response to a problem that had become sufficiently serious to affect trade and commerce. American Western routes faced different hazards. Organized banditry, in some periods, by gangs operating with a sophistication that reflected the near-total absence of law enforcement infrastructure in the territories through which the routes passed. The Wells Fargo Express box, bolted to the floor of the Concord coach and attended by an armed guard, was not a theatrical prop. It was a practical response to the frequency with which people tried to take it. And then there were the accidents. We have mentioned overturning, but let us be specific about what overturning a stagecoach on a mountain road or a river crossing actually meant for the people inside. The weight of a loaded Concord coach, with passengers and luggage and the express box, was over 1,000 kilograms. When that weight went sideways off a mountain track, or into a river, or over an embankment, the passengers inside were not protected by anything beyond the wooden walls of the coach itself. No seatbelts, no airbags, no structural crumple zones, no emergency services waiting at the bottom of the slope. People were killed in stagecoach accidents with a frequency that the operators of the lines tracked and accepted as a cost of doing business, and that passengers accepted as a risk of the journey in the same spirit in which they accepted the cold, the sickness, and the highwaymen. Why did they do it? Why did they climb into these vehicles and endure the jolting and the cold